everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics today. Today we are joined by Sidarta Ribeiro from Brazil, neuroscientist, full professor at do I have that right? You're a full professor at a certain school in Brazil?
I'm full professor of neuroscience, yes.
Oh, outstanding. Federal University, Rio Grande del Norte. Beautiful. And quite the background. Master's at in Rio, and then PhD, Rockefeller University, Animal Behavior. Beautiful. So you have spent some time stateside. You've got some affiliation with Schizophrenia. It's beautiful. Are you like a board member or advisor or anything there?
Yes, and I know Beatriz Labate for many, many years, and also Clancy Kavanagh and other folks.
Clancy's great too.
I love both of them. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I wish Clancy had more of a profile publicly. Someday we'll get on that.
Yes.
Yeah. So today I think we want to talk about all sorts of things, but I would love to talk about your sleep and dream research, a little bit of your octopus research, LSD, and there's a new substance that I had not heard of before, jurema, that we should absolutely talk about, and see where it goes. Also, these psychedelics. I think that'll be a fun topic. But let's talk about your origin story. So you grew up in Brazil, and then did you know you wanted to do neuroscience the whole time, or did it kind of just come to you eventually?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here. No, I was interested in biology, from childhood, but from the point of view of somebody that liked to snorkel and then later scuba dive.
Yeah.
And I was into Jacques Cousteau's movies, and so my plan when I was 15, my plan was to move to Rio and become a marine biologist. And then my mom convinced me to try some training period in a microbiology lab at the University of Brasilia to just probe, have a feeling of what that would feel, how biology would work for me. Mm-hmm. And then I engaged in research early on. I was 16, and I really thought that this was it for me for many years. And when I was 22 or so, I had this feeling that I didn't really want to investigate bacteria or protozoarians. I wanted to study the brain. And then between, say, the end of undergraduate studies and then the master's and the beginning of PhD at Rockefeller, I transited and I moved towards sleep and dreaming. That actually had something to do with my own experience coming to New York in the middle of winter, mm-hmm. having, becoming, sleeping most of the time, dreaming most of the time, and not being able to actually stay awake in most activities. And that lasted all the remaining part of the winter. And then at the very end of that period, I felt quite adapted. And I had this
That's super interesting.
Yeah, I had this very bodily sensation of adaptation that came from being able to sleep and dream. So I decided to go in that direction, and since then I've been doing that.
And this New York City, right? So
that was
like
New
coming
York,
from Brazil to a winter in New York City seems kind of like a nightmare for most people.
It was a shock. It was a shock. And I was at the time, the internet was still not up and running, and I didn't have access to the most up-to-date books or articles. So when I got there, I was already late. My colleagues had started in early autumn, and I was already midwinter. And so I couldn't really follow what was going on. I didn't understand the biology. I didn't know many of the things they were discussing were not present in the textbooks that I had access to. So I was not adapted in that sense. But also the language, even though I learned to read and write in English because I was in American school for a while. Mm-hmm. And I had, I could speak English. I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends during adolescence. But then when I got there, and during this stressful moment of trying to adapt to an ongoing PhD program, I started not understanding English. I would go to places and people would speak English, and it was something like wow, and I started to get anxious. So my sleep and dreaming, my excessive sleep and dreaming was also a response to this linguistic barrier. And it was so obvious to me then, when spring came, that what felt like a sabotage of my own body was actually my adaptation process. And then I decided to investigate the mechanisms. What are the genes? What are the proteins? What are the processes in terms of electrical activity in the brain that explain this?
That's super interesting. Wow. There's a lot we could go into there, obviously, and you've done a lot of work to expand on that. That's so fascinating, that just concept. It's almost like a special kind of isolation, kind of like a meditation or something, or a retreat. It's fascinating, with all sorts of other things going on, of course. That's really wild. And to think about how common that is really interesting, too. So many people do that.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing is to be able to embrace it rather than resist it.
Right. So maybe for like a popular audience, what might be some of the more more easily digestible for non-sleep scientists, dream scientists, like that you found about dreams?
Okay. So one thing there's this concept that comes from psychoanalysis of a day residue. The day residue in the Freudian terminology, it is the part of the dream that relates to the events of the previous day or the previous days. And as we know, most of the Freudian contribution and also Jungian contribution, all the what we call the field of depth psychology, this has been to a large extent rejected by science in the 20th century. So one of the things that I discovered in the first years of my research at Rockefeller was that when rats have nothing new to do with their lives, there were no new stimulation, they're just in a home cage. There are genes that are related to learning that get to be switched off during sleep. However, when they go through something new and interesting during the waking life, these genes, they are first turned off, and then when they go into dreaming sleep, the genes get to be turned on again. So there's this sort of like day residue at the molecular level. And this is something that I discovered.
So like methylation?
It's not methylation like epigenetic changes. It's actually the upregulation of the transcription of specific genes. For example, one that is called ZIF268, that have these genes like that and others that have to do with the long-term storage of memory. So when an animal is deprived of this gene, if, for example, you have a knockout of this gene, or if you block its expression, the animal will learn fine during waking, but then on the next day, it won't remember anything. So it doesn't consolidate the memory. And what I found is that this gene that is important for consolidation is reinduced during REM sleep, but only in animals that went through a novel experience. Then I learned that, and that was in my transition towards postdoc, that the expression of this gene moves away from a part of the brain called hippocampus and towards another part of the brain called cerebral cortex as the animal goes through sleep cycles. So you could think of sleep cycles as tides, as tidal waves that push memories away from the hippocampus towards the cortex, which is a huge space for coding, for representing memories. So it makes sense because the hippocampus is much smaller. It's the entry gate, but it cannot be the permanent storage site. So I had the first evidence. We know that memories tend to disengage from the hippocampus and become more corticalized over time. We know it since the 40s. The earliest evidence was in the 40s, and then it became clear in the 50s. But what we now believe, and this comes from my work, is that REM sleep is doing most of the job. That when you go into REM sleep, for a variety of molecular reasons, this process takes place. Then I moved back to Brazil and we created a brain institute here, which I directed for many years. Now I'm out of this position. And here with my students, we discovered a number of different things. I would highlight, first of all, the diagnostic value of dream reports for the diagnosis of schizophrenia. This is something that was very clear to the psychiatrists of the 19th century, that psychosis is some sort of dreaming. And this was very strongly believed
Whoa.
in the 19th century, and then it was lost in the 20th century. And we have uncovered evidence in the past 15 years or so that if you interview patients that are undergoing psychosis or at risk for psychosis, and if you ask them about a number of different topics, the topic that is most informative about their psychiatric state is actually a dream report.
That's super interesting. It makes a ton of sense too. Like I just thinking about it. That's quite interesting. Wow.
Yeah, because the dream is a mental object that is quite particular and uniquely linked to that person, right? There's when you tell me about your waking life, you're telling me about the mix of your mental life with that of many other people. So it's in the end, you sort of given your behaviors will have to do with the behaviors of others, and you tend to average everything in a way. While when you talk about a dream, this was self-generated, so it's more clearly expressing what's going on or how structured or unstructured the thoughts are. In more recent years, we embarked on octopus research. So we just demonstrated last year that the octopus has something quite similar to REM sleep from REM sleep, from dreaming sleep, from the point of view of their behaviors, how they move their eyes, how the skin changes colors and textures as well. And we showed that when every half an hour, they have about a minute of what we call active sleep, which is akin to REM sleep. And if you stimulate them with, for example, images of moving crabs, which they usually attack to try to eat, during they are in this active sleep state, they're totally unresponsive. So they're sleeping really.
Wow. Yeah, I saw the title of the episode of Science Friday you did was something along the lines of, we dream about octopus. Do they dream of us? It's quite the interesting question.
Yes. Yes.
I was really close to a few the other day, but I somehow just couldn't discern them. Their camouflage is so good.
In Hawaii.
Yes.
Cool.
It was beautiful. Just generally, I think I took a photo or a bunch of them, but I just couldn't see it in the moment. Everybody else saw it but me. It was really neat. Yeah. You saw the articles around MDMA with octopus. Did you have any impression of that study at all?
Yeah, I think it's really cool because MDMA produces all these affective behaviors in humans, and to see similar things going on in an animal that has been evolving separately from our lineage for 500 million years, it's quite surprising. Actually shows that the effects of MDMA are rooted on a very ancient mechanisms.
Is that about the number 500 million?
Pretty much, yeah. So I think MDMA is really provoking a revolution in psychiatry. Not alone. I mean, of course, with many different psychedelics and cannabis as well. But to see that similar things can be produced in animals that are so distant, I think it gives a very profound meaning to those clinical findings.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right. I think I want to jump to schizophrenia a little further. So, is there more we're learning about schizophrenia as a result of neuroscience research in psychedelics, or is there a real gold mine you're seeing anywhere in schizophrenia research around psychedelics or any other area?
Well, that in the 60s, people were trying to treat patients with schizophrenia with psychedelics. And even though some people say that this is something to be considered, most researchers, pretty much all of them, will now agree that it's not a good idea, right? And I understand there's
Is there
still
a why there?
Well, because people that cannot tell the difference between inner reality and outer reality, they tend to mix it even more when they take psychedelics. And for that matter, when they practice lucid dreaming. So, I mean, it's for the same sort of reason. I do know people that will say that this doesn't have to be so, because of course people have very different mechanisms that take them to a diagnosis like that. There's also the fact that we don't really know what schizophrenia is. We don't really know. We don't know what are the biological basis of schizophrenia. We know it has a biological basis, but we don't know what it is. We have some hints, and we don't quite know whether the category of schizophrenia will remain as such in the future in relationship to autism and to bipolar disorder and to the spectrum of phenotypes that are possible. And because there's the effects of many genes that produce conditions like that, we really need to learn more and do more research. What I do think is a breakthrough, in fact, and has been. I went to the World Congress of Psychiatry right before the pandemic hit in Lisbon, and for me, what was quite surprising was to see that across countries in many different regions of the world, people are coming to the understanding that in most instances of mental disorders that either reflect cognitive problems or perceptual problems or differences, let's even put it as differences, and emotional differences and so on. Lots of psychotherapy and less use of drugs is better than the other way around. And this is a reversal from the course taken in the past 50 years. Right? So it's now very clear that not just for neurosis, but also for psychosis, people need to be listened to. People need to dialogue. People need to have access to sophisticated techniques of care that can be aided by substances, but they cannot be replaced by substances. So I think there's a paradigm shift now going on, and psychedelics, of course, are boosting it, because in psychedelics, first of all, the dose is small and occasional. Second, the effect is super strong, so you really need to have a good setting, which of course includes a good therapist or shaman for that matter. So I think that now psychiatry is starting to come to terms with its own failure. Psychiatry has not delivered what it promised when they started giving antidepressants, inhibitors of the reuptake of serotonin to pretty much everybody. And I think this was a big mistake. I'm not saying these drugs are not useful. They actually tend to have effects beyond the placebo, but these effects are very, very small. And they tend to, the studies usually run for like 8 weeks, and people have been taking those drugs for years now. And those studies usually assess a single substance, and now people are taking 5 or 6 substances. So the fact is that people have been getting treatment that has no real scientific basis, and they have the impression that it does. And I think psychedelics are basically tearing down this whole temple.
It's a radical revision in psychiatry generally, right? It's like psychiatry is going under like probably one of the biggest. I've not seen a bigger revolution in science ever. I can't think of one than probably what's happening right now. Like we're seeing a lot more like willingness to critique what was done and how we're approaching things. And DSM is going through major revisions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's great to see this kind of awesome revolution in science and medicine.
I was reading your profile, and I realized how close you are to Stan Grof's holotropic method. I think
our episode with him just came out today.
Okay. Hail to the master.
Finally.
Awesome. I think it's just it's a huge vindication of people like him and many others who in the 50s and 60s and 70s and they kept fighting, and they kept keeping their eyes open against this discourse, right? That there's some drugs from God and drugs from the devil, and that this entire thing that really was about selling substances on a daily basis. It was really about the market, not about health. And I'm not trying to demonize the traditional antidepressants, or traditional is not a good word, the conventional antidepressants.
Conventional, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's clear that there was conflict of interest there.
Yeah, the data is not as good as people suppose it is.
Not even close.
It still should be part of the pharmacopoeia, obviously, but it's like
Of course,
really...
and we should be very tolerant with that. Yeah.
Exactly, and it's a common bias we have in the psychedelic space, right? Because our drugs are so good and theirs are so bad. It's like, come on.
Yeah, we need to go beyond that, and in the end, what matters, and I think even in the case of, say, fluoxetine, there's evidence now, which is the most conventional of those antidepressants. There is good evidence now in mice, so it's not a placebo effect, that if you give fluoxetine to an animal that is being kept in a very healthy, fun, enriched environment, it will work as an antidepressant. But if you apply the same substance at the same dose to an animal that is living under harsh conditions, deprived of stimulation, and that makes the animal feel unsafe, the same substance will be provoking depression, will prompt depression. So I think the attention to the setting is something that conventional psychiatry really neglected. And now it has to face it, and it has to change the discourse, and there's new research to be done, new things to be tried. I think the whole field of assessing the effects of setting in a quantitative manner that you can parameterize, this is an amazing frontier, a brave new world for research.
It really is, yeah. Have you heard of this psychiatric nurse practitioner in Australia named Matt Ball? He's probably somebody. After this, I'll take a note and I'll send you some podcasts with him. Diagnosed schizophrenic, and has a really interesting frame to kind of overlap between the psychedelic experience and schizophrenia generally. It's a really, really fascinating talk track, and he's developed this really cool model of something like peer support in Australia. So maybe instead of getting hospitalized, you go hang out with a bunch of peers and like really lovely non-clinicians that aren't as threatening to diagnose schizophrenics, right? Because that relationship between clinicians and schizophrenia, people diagnosed schizophrenic, is really complicated.
Yes.
And not to be... Yeah.
It's a stigma. And I really like to read Julian Jaynes. Of course, his contribution is still very controversial, and many of the things that he proposed cannot be tested. Some can be tested and have been tested, actually. But I think this notion that in the past, and perhaps quite recently as 3,000 years ago, that people were valued for being psychotic and that they had a special place in society rather than being outcasts. I think this idea is very potent, and I think that when we look into the role of original behavior, let's put it that way, in hunter-gatherer societies, for example, the people that behave quite strangely, they are often tolerated, and they become like a reservoir of bold ideas. And this is a treasure trove, a cultural treasure trove, which in our society, there's so much stigma that these people, they get to be shunned, and they really can't help and participate in the social, in the world and interaction. I think it's a little bit like when people realize that if you have a coworker that has Down syndrome, this is going to be probably quite good for the office. And to see that people that are different, or a person that has autism with high performance, can be tremendously powerful and instrumental in a team. So to be able to see how diversity can push us forward and to embrace all those differences. I think we're not there yet with psychosis, but I think we should move in that direction.
Are you familiar with this is very different from neuroscience, but permaculture? Have you heard of this concept?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like the one of the fundamental concepts in permaculture is diversity equals strength and resilience. It's like strength, resilience, and power all in one. So, as we maximize diversity, we're maximizing resilience in a system, and that's not to be underestimated. There's some really
That's ecology. Yes, that's ecology.
basic
And that has all to do with our emerging knowledge about the microbiota and how the diversity of the microorganisms that live inside us can help us live better, digest better, have less inflammation. So I think that we're coming to an understanding that is quite new, but it's also quite aligned with ancient knowledge from non-scientific sources of knowledge. So, for example, the fermented diets are not something that science invented. This is coming from right from
Right.
the East. It's coming from East also, and I think we're coming to terms with all that, and it's exciting actually.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's yeah, it's this idea that there are many ways of knowing is a really hard thing to sell to like really hard-nosed scientists at times. Only things. The concept of logical positivism. The only thing we can really have any meaningful discussion about is things that are like peer-reviewed papers. It's like
Yes.
we can't talk about art really unless it's from.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting critique. Like we're kind of living in a logical positivist frame right now, and we're
Yes.
about to jump out of it because of these kinds of nuanced conversations. Like, yes, indigenous folks have a lot of value to add here, and we can learn from their way of knowing and try to kind of merge this ancient and modern. Terence McKenna had this phrase like future primitive. I think it's really important.
I like it. There's a native Brazilian thinker, Ailton Krenak. He has amazing books. One is called "Ideas to Delay the End of the World," and he has this phrase that says, "Future is ancestral." In many ways, we need to recover things that were lost in the past without romanticizing the past, right? So one thing I've been reading and I really enjoy it is The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Weinberg. What's his name?
I'll check it out, and it'll be in the show notes for sure.
Yeah,
I think I'll buy it tonight.
David Graeber and David Wengrow.
Okay.
And in this book, they argue very convincingly that we've been thinking of prehistory basically in terms of myth making. I mean, very, very little evidence and a lot of imagination that is supposedly supported by evidence. And I think it's interesting you say, oh, we're now living in this moment of positive empiricism or something like that. But actually, it's more like a belief, really, because in many cases, people are just assuming some things as if they were based on evidence. But in fact, there is no evidence, right? The prehistory was so much longer than history, and so many things happened there, and it's very easy to gloss over what could have happened and just come up with some explanation that makes sense to us. And usually there's a conflict of interest behind that. Usually there's a reason that is instrumental, that is sort of a transactional even, for why people have some view. And I think that it's very auspicious for science that psychedelics are back in the game, because for most people that get in contact with psychedelics, it becomes very obvious that there is no unique perspective and that everything is a metaphor. When we say that the atom is like a bunch of little balls glued together, this is metaphorical. Of course, real physicists will say, oh, it's not like that. It's actually, there's another underlying reality, and and they will talk about the quarks. But then in the end, they're going to talk about quarks that have a color, and that's another metaphor. So in fact, all descriptions of the world are metaphors, and we need to be very respectful with other people's metaphors. Now, that is not to say that there is no possible common ground. So of course, I don't believe, for example, that it makes sense for people to be against vaccination in the COVID situation. Okay, but to get to that point, we need to be respectful with people's metaphors and understand their fears, and then try to have a common ground. Perhaps we wouldn't be in such a dire situation in the world if, well, first of all, if we didn't have so much accumulation of financial power that does not get to be shared. That's one. But also, if we were not concentrating the scientific knowledge so much. So scientists out there are super specialized. They know lots about one very specific thing, but most people don't have access to that. So it's quite impossible to come together on anything because we don't share a similar basis. And that's why it's so important to make education the priority for the whole world, to make people really, really have the best possible access to education. That's the only thing that can really save us from fighting until the end of the world.
Bringing us back to the, I think it was a Bertrand Russell quote, Godfather of logical positivism. It's like, I think it was him. Like, history is it's a constant race between education and destruction, or something along those lines. And it's spot on with what you're saying. And I'm hopeful because, you've seen like MIT X and all these like moves to make university grade education free, which is phenomenal. And, the rise of podcasting, YouTube, etc. Like, that's where I think we're going, 98% of what we've done here at Psychedelic today is free. And it's like,
very cool. Yeah.
It's how do we just keep moving that in that direction? And, the American university system is really rough, but I imagine it's better elsewhere, and helpful at scale. Or you might know better than me.
Well, yeah. The thing is this. I mean, the U.S. probably has nearly all of the best universities in the world still. And of course, some of those are in Europe. Some of the great ones are in Europe. Some great ones in Israel and Japan. And then things change a lot as you go from the first world to the third world. When I was in the US, it was clear to me that the third tier or even fourth tier universities are usually better than the universities in South America.
Oh, wow.
Than the best universities in South America. And that part of that is because of the sheer difference in funding, but a lot has to do also with the sustained investment in human capital. So in the US, you really can find, in the universities, you can find excellence on every single level. And this is what universities should be all over the world. I think we will not get to a moment of peace and harmony if we're not able to democratize, to give open access, wide access to good education to most people. And I don't think this can happen if the rich continue to fight paying taxes and to continue to dodge their responsibility. The super rich, I mean. I'm not talking about folks that make whatever 200K a year. That's wealthy, but not super rich. I'm talking about the billionaires, those 10 men that became twice as rich during the pandemic. So if they don't understand their role in the world, if they think that their role is to continue to prey on the weakest, we're doomed, because this is, people will not accept to be oppressed, but they also cannot really win this thing. So we need an expansion of consciousness, so that the strongest take care of the weakest and allow the weakest to thrive and to blossom and to, right? I mean, the future in which all the boring work will be done by robots, which is what Elon Musk is provoking and saying. Either people will be doing poetry and philosophy and scuba diving, or they will be turning trash cans.
Yeah, it's tough. And, we see that in Japan now with, I how does Japan plan to take care of their elderly with robots, because they're producing so few children. There's going to be a massive population shortage for elder care. They're also kind of a xenophobic culture, so like foreigners aren't necessarily, we America brings in a lot of foreign workers, but I don't think Japan wants to do that. But it's an interesting concept, right? Like what other kinds of dynamics are there? But it's a whole fascinating conversation. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, one of the things we chatted about that I'm really excited about is LSD. The fact that you're actually doing LSD research. You said rodents, mini brains, and actual human use in Brazil.
Yes.
Amazing. So exciting to me, because it's so underrepresented in the university right now.
Yes, we were able to set up a network of researchers here in Brazil, which involves Luis Fernando Toffoli in the University of Campinas, Stevens Rain at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, my colleague Braulio de Araújo here at the Brain Institute of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte. And this has been done with funding from the Beckley Foundation and in collaboration with Amanda Fielding, our hero,
That's
our intellectual
why.
hero, and art hero.
Yeah.
And so we've been able to, in collaboration, advance the research across species, across experimental models, also doing some computational modeling. So there's a lot that we have learned now from the molecular side of the story that can then be modeled to come up with predictions that we can test in experiments at the systemic level, say at the investigating activity of neurons across brain regions. So those things can be done now in an integrated manner, and we have been focusing on LSD. We also study DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT. My friend Braulio investigates ayahuasca, and now he's investigating jurema, which is a Native American preparation of DMT as well. So I think it's really exciting, and for me, it is exciting to be able to participate in the psychedelic renaissance, not being in the U.S., not being in any of the first world countries in terms of funding and tradition in science. So the fact that we find a space that we can publish our papers and that we can participate in the dialogue is quite exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's actually so many reasons why it's great that this is now an international project. Amanda's been doing really great work, and all of Beckley helping that. Like, they're doing some really cool stuff in, I believe, Portugal, Spain. I think there's something going on in Ibiza, which is fascinating. Yeah, it's a really just awesome project. I hope there's going to be more universities picking up this work in Brazil as well.
It is growing.
I don't think people understand how big Brazil is either. It's such a big country.
It is. And until very recently, this topic was quite difficult, not just to research, but even talk about it. And there were some pioneers, in particular Professor Dartil Xavier da Silveira, studying ibogaine. Also Eduardo Schemberg, who started the first MDMA studies in Brazil. And he also worked with David Nutt and Robin Card Harris in that LSD paper in PNAS. So over the years, and of course we talked about her before, Beatriz Labate, who's an anthropologist, has been very important for the dissemination of this knowledge, and also for bringing awareness to the importance of not neglecting traditional knowledge and the traditional source of psychedelic knowledge. One person I didn't mention, but also I should, is Richardson Leão, another researcher from the Brain Institute that has been showing, for example, the induction of neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons after the treatment with DMT. So what 20 years ago was a career end is now quite sexy. It's something that is bringing funds, and there's a lot of interest, not just in scientific journals, but also in foundations, and also among artists and documentary filmmakers. So it's really the profile of those scientific meetings in Oakland, for example, about psychedelic science, the profile changed a lot. It used to be basically token folks and some scientists. and now it's entirely different.
Yeah, I was actually just at a conference recently, really small, but in Denver. 20% white people. It was
That's a
mind
major
blowing, right in
change.
Denver.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
I couldn't believe it. Really, really helpful and hopeful to see that kind of thing.
Very cool.
And so, yeah, like that, Beatrice Labate, Bia Labate is what we call her around here, runs Chacruna. She's kind of the head of that organization. She's done so much. So, really thankful for Bia.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because this is kind of an extension of the discussions. A lot of the we call them early psychedelic pioneers, aka hippies, like the Esalen thing. Like there was a lot of this transpersonal psychology leaning towards like what do we do here with these knowledge systems that are obviously really advanced and like really well developed. What do we do? Because they can instantiate really interesting experiences. Because transpersonal psychology, from what I understand, is really focused on the experience of what happened, not necessarily why it happened. Like, yes, it happened. So that's all. And you use these techniques to get there. Cool. So, like, what do we do next? And, this now kind of resurgence of, like, learning from ancient wisdom, these, like, long-standing lineages. It's a similar conversation, just kind of like a slightly different tone, maybe. So it's really great to see it's like continuing and developing and expanding. Now, before we jump back to LSD, can you talk just a little bit about jurema? Is it smoked? Is it what is it?
It's something you drink. It's like a concoction. It's made from. It's related to a religion called jurema. Also, that is the name of like a forest goddess. And this has roots in the northernmost part of Brazil and northeast part of Brazil. And there are several things that we don't know about it. Braulio de Araújo has been investigating the question. Also, journalist Marcelo Leite is planning to help Braulio in this investigation because it is not clear, for example, what is used in Jurema to protect the degradation against the degradation of DMT. So in ayahuasca, there are substances that come from the vine, Banisteriopsis capi, that will protect, they will inhibit monoamino oxidases that degrade DMT. So these substances protect DMT. It isn't clear whether there is something like that in Jurema. So there's a level of research that needs to happen that is still at the level of ethnography in basic pharmacology. And then, of course, you have the cultural aspect because it's a whole religion organized around it. It has very clear Native American roots, but it came to be mixed in with different traditions, syncretized, quite hybrid in its current expression. And this religion around it has very strong representations of the forest. So I think it's a wealth of information. It's actually a frontier for research that is integrative, that comes from the biological point of view, but also from the anthropological point of view.
That's beautiful. Yeah, great. Now LSD, like why LSD from your point of view? Like why are you all looking at it? Like is it super interesting or unique or what's going on there?
Well, it's not. Of course, there's so many synthetic compounds out there, right? So if you think that there's so many already and so many to be synthesized, why would you pick one? But among those that are well known, LSD I think stands out for a number of reasons. First, because it acts with such small doses. I mean, that's not negligible. Most psychedelic substances will act. You will need to take many milligrams to have an effect, and with LSD, we're talking about micrograms. And it's amazing that a substance can be in your body with such a small number of molecules and produce such a huge effect in perception and attention and consciousness in general. Second of all, I think we owe much to the researchers in the 50s and 60s who advanced so much, and many of them were studying LSD, and LSD was such an important molecule for psychiatric research in the 60s, and most of this research has been made invisible, has been trashed, has been neglected, and has
Right.
been made
The
unavailable.
scientific rigor was so poor that they're all worthless now, and
Right.
that kills me.
Yeah, this discourse, I think it's a political discourse, which is disguised with the rigor of science. And I don't think it is true. And I think we really need to reassess all that. It was not a small amount of work. It was a lot of people doing a lot of work for many years, and doing and running experiments on a daily basis in many different places. You have, when I see the CBS. I believe it's CBS documentary about the clinical research done with LSD, and this was such a mainstream thing at some point, and then all the backlash. So I think that we really need to reassess and resume, and continue. This is one big reason for me. Another reason is because I began my experience with psychedelics investigating ayahuasca together with my colleague and friend Draulio Araújo. But I realized as we began to publish our research, that it would be always an uphill battle with reviewers because it's such a complex potion. So at least two different plants to make it, and those plants have many different molecules, and of course you run into combinatorial explosion of factors if you try to parameterize everything. So in that sense, to be able to work with a substance that is a single molecule and that acts that has very strong effects even at very low doses is quite attractive, because then you can come up with some mechanisms of action that make sense and are simple enough. I'm not saying that I lost interest in ayahuasca, not at all. I'm just saying that I think we need to advance those frontiers in parallel and not do one versus the other.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's ayahuasca research is endlessly fascinating in and of itself, but the way science wants to operate, we have to understand a single molecule first before we understand, many molecules first. Absolutely. And yeah, there's so much literature. I believe at one point it was the most researched LSD, the most researched compound in the world, right?
And then, yeah, in the 60s, it's unbelievable. It's like tons of papers and books. And it is true that some of that research, or perhaps even most of it, did not adhere to what we now think is the minimum to be able to believe a study. But if you apply this kind of reasoning to a lot of the neuroscience and psychology research in the past 2 decades, you can also come to the same conclusions. There's many people arguing that with the small number of subjects per group that most people use for their publications, then you really can't conclude anything. And I think there's some traps in this discourse. If you find that there is a blue unicorn in the world, you really need only one to convince people that they exist. Now, if you need to convince people that this is something that is significant, then you need to have a number of observations. And how you assess that and how you establish significance, it depends on other assumptions. So this is a complicated issue. I think it gets to the heart of the problem of replicability in science. Many things that were discovered in the past 20 or 30 years cannot be replicated, and so we need to take a step back and reassess a lot of the stuff. But that's not to say that small studies cannot be true. I think it really depends on how they were done, how the conflicts of interest were dealt with, and there are ways in which you can do it. I mean, we know how to do it. You can do blinding, you can do controls and randomization and so on. And I think that to look into the research done in the 60s as if it was monolithic, as if it was just one bad way of doing things is wrong. To take it all at face value, it's also not the proper thing to do. We need to be critical, but also to be interested, to be curious. To, many times people think they're having original ideas and testing original hypotheses, and in fact, those things were discussed a long time ago. They were addressed, and maybe they were already answered, and we need to be open to that as well.
Yeah, to set up a very expensive research project without having perused or become familiar with all that has been done in the past seems a bit irresponsible. So, at the very least, spend some time with that material, folks, before you're going to spend a few $1,000,000 in research. Might save some money and might make your research that much more impactful, right?
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. Do you, so many directions I want to go. Do you see LSD as possibly being a dominant player in the drug space when treatment becomes more available, or do you think it might be too politically controversial still?
I think it will be one among many. Mm-hmm. I think it will always be quite important for intrinsic reasons, but also for the cultural reasons. But I don't think it will be the substance. I think right now MDMA and psilocybin are taking the lead research-wise, and I think also in terms of the funding of initiatives. But I think we're going to go into after the end of the war on drugs, and after psychedelics are.
I appreciate your phrasing there.
Yes, and after psychedelics are fully reinstated as a legitimate object of research, I think this is happening really, and we're probably almost there. But I think that we'll go through a phase in which many other compounds will be synthesized and investigated, and we'll be able to have a very wide range of possibilities for therapeutics. There's now this whole trend, we were talking about it before, there's now this whole trend of investigating psychedelics that do not induce psychoactive states. Sorry, psychedelics that are not psychoactive, that do not induce altered states of mind. And I am very much in favor of this research, and I think it's great. First of all, because this research will allow us to understand better the relationship between, on one hand, cellular, molecular effects of psychedelics, and on the other hand, psychological effects of psychedelics. And we know that those levels are articulated, but they are not the same thing, and they can be dissociated to some extent. So in terms of the science advancing, I think it's great, and I think it's also great that people that need the help of psychedelics but do not want to trip will be able to have some benefit from it. Now, what I don't like, and I think it's either naive or disingenuous or even quite misleading, is to claim, and I see lots of people, scientists, journalists, and capitalists going that direction, is to say that the non-psychoactive psychedelics are the good ones, the preferred ones, that this is the right way of doing the therapy. I think this would be similar to saying that sex without orgasm is better than sex with orgasm. And I think I see how misleading this can be, because for people that never had a psychedelic experience, this may seem so comforting. They'll say, "Oh, I'm afraid of that, but I don't need to do that. I don't need to go there." But it's quite disrespectful of the traditional uses, and it's quite ignorant of the beauty and the richness and the challenge of the psychedelic experience to think that you could get most of its benefits without ever going there. I think it's in Brazil we have an expression for that, which is conversa para boi dormir. It's a kind of talk that puts the ox to sleep.
Can you talk a little bit further about Super funny. How it is actually disrespectful to a lot of the indigenous or older traditions that we might be able to get those benefits. I think it's like helpful to really spell that argument out for
Yeah,
folks.
yeah. So of course, in so many Native American traditions, North America, Central America, South America, and so many African traditions and Asian traditions and Australian Aboriginal traditions. I mean, we can go on and on in Europe as well. If you look for Druids, for example, you'll see that the state of being in a dream, whether it's a dream coming from REM sleep or a dream caused by a psychedelic or a
Mm-hmm.
dream caused by fever or a dream caused by fasting or
Mm-hmm.
pain, in the case of the sun dance. So there are many, many ways in which a person can go into this dream state. And this dream state is not important per se, it's not therapeutic per se, it's actually an opening into a path that can allow you to find a diagnosis, a treatment, a cure. So there are journeys of spiritual healing and journeys of spiritual growth that will take place, and they will take place as the representation of the dreamer meets other creatures of the mind, or in their terms, meet other spirits,
Mm-hmm.
and learn from them and exchange with them. And these are the most important things, these encounters and the stuff that gets to be culturally exchanged, and what you're able to bring back from this difficult and dangerous journey. To then say that this is all fantasy and what we really need is to jumpstart some metabolic cascade inside cells is to, I think, not miss the point entirely, but miss a big part of it. And again, I don't want to have the opposite argument and say these substances shouldn't be there, shouldn't be studied, and they're no. They're interesting, and I said why I think they're interesting, but I think they need to be very respectful of all the knowledge that came before science that brought us knowledge about these substances, but also, and perhaps more importantly, about the inner realities and, in their view, outer realities
Mm-hmm.
that allow one to change, because these substances, they promote change, they promote synaptic plasticity, they promote neuroplasticity, they allow the brain to change. But what is really important is to know in which direction you're going to change, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you just enhance the plasticity and the setting is dull and the music is a disaster and the words are not of wisdom, it's not going to be good. And if it's just something that people neglect entirely, and there's no stimulation, no setting whatsoever, if you're facing a white wall, this is also not going to be superior in any way to the full experience that is grounded and rooted in tradition.
An extension I'm seeing to some themes we discussed earlier is it's like depth psychology can seem a little atheistic, but when we start adding on Groff and Jung, it becomes a little less so, and or a lot less so in terms of Groff. And there's something there. Like this concept seems very anti-depth. Like we're kind of just neuro machines, like chemical soup. We're probably a little bit more than neuro soup, right? Like, and you're a neuroscientist shaking your head, so awesome. And it's not always the case we get that kind of buy-in, but it's there's some sort of link there between these really deep, really harrowing experiences that people have lived through for thousands of years and benefited from in many ways. And like the idea that let's just take this and then I'm fixed. No therapy required, no work required. Like it's not ibuprofen. It's not. This is not antibiotics. This is different.
Yes, I think you said the work that I think is the key to understand this. It's work. It's work, and the Native Americans understand that, and they prepare for hard work, and they know it's going to be difficult, and they gather strength to be able to do that. And I think that we're living in the Western Eurocentric world this notion that you're ill and you can be cured just by a molecule, just by a substance, without having to do any work. I think this is most often not the case. Yes, it is the case for, say, antibiotics. Usually, if you have a bad infection, if you have the right antibiotic, it will be gone, and the work is actually to take a pill. But for mental suffering, not at all. I don't believe that you can, and this is clear even for MDMA, right? What is being proposed by MAPS, what Rick Doblin has been championing, is not to substitute, to replace fluoxetine with MDMA, but it's actually to to shift the gaze and say we are now doing MDMA assisted psychotherapy. It's an entire different way of approaching, and it's much more aligned and in tune with traditional practices than conventional psychiatry.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a totally different reframing. And there's been an interesting discussion lately in my circles around how different psychotherapy is compared to these psychedelic sessions. Psychedelic work is very different. That's going to be a hard conversation because I think a lot of therapists want to own this as their thing, but it's, possibly not psychotherapy. Psychotherapy can be really helpful before, after, maybe a little bit inside, but there's so much complexity here that this isn't like all drug sessions should be run by psychotherapists and prescribed by psychiatrists. It's a little too reductionist, maybe.
They need to acknowledge the role of women and men that come from many different traditions, and these traditions have been going on for many, many, many generations. They need to acknowledge their knowledge, and they need to learn from them. And if they don't do that, they will probably make the same mistake again, to refuse knowledge and to disrespect knowledge.
Yeah. So, shifting gears a little bit, microdosing. And perhaps microdosing things like DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. You mentioned neurogenesis. This is a really big topic. There's a lot of case studies. I don't really know where to go with this yet. I've been really curious about it, but there's a lot of CTE, if not just generalized brain damage, that happens in sports, combat, elsewhere, and female soccer players. Obviously, that's a big topic. How do we, or do you see any hope? And I've been talking about this kind of publicly, hoping somebody would do a trial eventually, but microdosed 5-MeO-DMT or microdosed DMT on some sort of a rigorous schedule to help with symptoms that could be indicative of CTE or other kinds of brain damage from trauma.
Okay, I really like this question, but I want to separate it in two parts.
Please.
Microdosing is a cultural phenomenon, but we're still not sure whether it has a biological basis beyond the placebo effect.
Agreed.
And right now, if you look at the literature and what the recent 5 or 6 papers that came out on this, they disagree. Some say it's just placebo, and some others say it's beyond placebo. I think if it's just placebo, it's actually fine. We should embrace the placebo. Placebo is actually just a name for mechanisms that are already within our body and that require our belief. And placebo, so it's in a fantastic technology for improving your health that comes probably from the Paleolithic and that we should embrace. But I think nobody will argue that of course, for a range of doses, the higher the dose, the stronger the effect. So it's obvious that whether we can have biological effects for microdoses that are beyond biology, whether we can have biological effects of microdosing that are beyond the placebo, whether this is going to hold or not, and we'll know in the next few coming years, it's going to go one way or another. It's obvious that most therapeutic uses will come from higher doses, from real doses. And there's a bunch of papers now showing that when you're doing it for depression, for example, you get more benefits if you have a higher dose. But of course, that means also have more attention to the setting, because so that you can deal with that higher dose. Now, so this is one part of the question. The other part of the question is whether we can go beyond psychiatry in the therapeutic use of psychedelics. So can psychedelics be helpful to regenerate and to heal lesion brains in a variety of manners? So basically going from psychiatry to neurology. And my hunch is yes, and there's already a few indications that this is going to be the case. I think we're going to see a lot of surprise in the research of psychedelics applied to stroke, for example. Yes.
That's right. There are some pharma companies doing stroke research. I think with intravenous DMT, they're doing some clinical trials on.
Yes.
Or not stroke. I'm thinking coma, but stroke also. That's really
stroke,
interesting.
Coma, concussion. There's if it is, it seems like all these psychedelic substances that are similar to serotonin, and also THC in cannabis, they act through different receptors, but they have common effects that have to do with enhanced synaptic plasticity, in many cases also enhanced neurogenesis. And this is what you need when you have brain trauma. Of course, then you need also to guide it properly. It's not just about rewiring, but rewiring properly. But this has to do with experience, with enriched environments. I think it's very fertile to investigate, and this is something I've been doing in my own lab, to investigate the synergy between psychedelic treatment and environmental enrichment. I think this combination is really this is what's going to tell us how to apply it to the clinical care in an optimized manner.
Yeah. Right, because we do have to worry about optimization. We do have to figure that out. And
So, for example, we have research done in rats in which we treat them with LSD, and after a few days we expose them to novel objects. And animals that got treated with LSD, they become more curious, they become more prone to novelty. And this effect is very clear in young animals. It's also clear, but less so in adults. And it's less clear in old animals. And it's actually not significant in old animals. So you could think the effect is actually there. You can see it's going in the right direction, but it doesn't reach significance in those old animals. However, if we combine the LSD treatments with exposure to enriched environments, then you have the effect. So even if the animal is quite old. So you would then say if we could transport these findings to humans, which we're not totally sure, but if we could, that would mean that especially for the elderly, the setting is going to be as important as the substance. And having a rich setting, having a set of stimuli that are novel and pleasant and thought-provoking is going to be tremendously important and something that we need to experiment with so as to enhance the benefits. So thinking of LSD and psychedelics, not just for the treatment of those that are ill, but thinking of them as cognitive enhancers or nootropic substances, that means understanding much better how drug and environment interact.
I like that. And, for whatever reason, I'm thinking like prescriptions for Burning Man. Like you've got to like very novel, very fun environment, though treacherous.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
or scuba diving.
yes.
Who knows? Like it's really interesting. Like what are these novel environments, and why have we created these kind of toxic environments to live in, or at least non-novel?
Yes.
Is
Yes.
a lack of novelty toxic? That's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
Probably from the neuroscientist perspective. Yeah. Do you have any speculation around the cardiac issue as it relates to 5-HT2B and microdosing?
Well, I know little about it, and I wouldn't like to
Yeah, no worries.
speculate based on my small knowledge. Um,
Amanda was questioned on
I'm
this at
I'm paying
Horizons.
attention. I'm paying attention. I want to see how things unfold.
Yeah, cool. I'm more, yeah, I'm always more interested in macrodosing for a number of reasons, but it's still good to know that some people can microdose for 6 months and not necessarily have to use ever again if they don't want to. Like that's a nice to know. And it's lifelong chronic microdosing. I don't think is the goal for anybody, I don't believe people should be choosing that as their goal. But yeah, like
How big is it now there?
it's getting really big. Um, you'd probably be hard pressed to find any medium or large city where it isn't getting pretty popular.
I see.
Yeah, and even small towns they're all talking about it because it's not threatening. It's cheap. You're there's actually all sorts of companies manufacturing microdose products that you can get mail order now. Not even
I see.
using dark web. It's just like
Wow.
open. Yeah,
With
it's fascinating.
psilocybin.
Psilocybin, a little bit of LSD, primarily psilocybin though. But there's coaches now active in helping people microdose all sorts of things. Everything from ibogaine to ayahuasca vine, copy leaf. It's really really fascinating. I don't I don't necessarily know how to feel about it as a whole yet because it's not really in my lane. And I like the scarier things, like the bigger things. Like it's yeah. Like
Did you try Bufo?
um so 5-MeO DMT from the Sonoran Desert Toad? No. Massive ecological concerns on my side around it, especially with the popularity from celebrities. I've had access to it a number of times. I'm in Arizona regularly, so I could go on my own hunt, but there's actually also this really interesting thing where humans can introduce fungus and wipe out huge areas of the toad. So you've got to be really careful in those environments. So my company is very against it for now until we figure out how to make sure those populations are healthy, big, and
I see.
yeah, it's mostly like an ecological concern, like
Okay.
animal
Like
rights.
peyote as well.
Yeah,
Peyote also
exactly.
suffering.
Yeah,
Yes.
we advise gringos to not go there. If you're not part of a Native American church, please don't do it. It's kind of our thing. But I understand that white people are still jumping into Native American church and still find a really good religious connection. So it's
I
more
see.
like if it's your religion, maybe it's okay. But it's like don't be a tourist with peyote. I don't think is there. Yeah,
Here.
yeah. We've done so much bad stuff to indigenous folks here. I'm just like, please, give them a lot of space, please. Yeah. And there's other ways to get mescaline that's not so hard. Yeah.
Yes.
And same thing with 5-MeO DMT. I was looking at some markets a while ago, and the pricing on synthetic 5-MeO DMT is wildly cheap. Per trip, it was like $5 or less. It looked like to me, and like the the economics of enlightenment are becoming really interesting. You used to have to spend 20 years at an ashram, and now you can do it in 2 minutes to have the experience. Like, oh, here's $5, or I know facilitators are charging a lot of money, but the substance is quite affordable.
Yeah, this is something of when I see the, Wall Street moving in the direction of psychedelics, I cannot help but think that they probably won't get the profit that they are envisioning.
There's going to
Because
be a
the
few,
value,
right? But 90% of them are
yeah,
not. Maybe even 98% of them are not.
and the value is in human work. The value is for the people the sitters and the people that really know how
Drugs
to
are
hold your
cheap.
hands, and exactly, and in small doses and occasional doses. So I think there's some, but let them think so. Let them think that it's gonna.
The governments are not funding the research, so we're kind of reliant on capitalists to fund the research. So I'm like, capitalists, please come on over. Let's see if it's going to work out. All right, little tech snafu there. We were kind of chatting about how major governments, international organizations aren't really funding this research to the level we need right now, and really, capitalists, these large organizations, are the ones that are banking on large returns. But maybe it's not there. But we need you. We need these people to come in to revolutionize healthcare, revolutionize our understanding of the mind and the soul and all this other fun stuff that's essential to delaying the end of the world. What was the name of that book you had earlier?
Ideas to Delay the End of the World by Ailton Krenak with a K.
I love it. I love it. But yeah, like really, we've got a lot of problems to solve here on the planet. Psychedelics can help with a number of them. Certainly not all of them, but plenty. And yeah, we need those people with a lot of money to come forward to help us do this work.
Absolutely. They're very welcome.
Yeah, right. And I try my best to make them feel welcome too. And it's complicated because it's highly political. For a lot of reasons, right? This is a religious thing. It's a cultural identity thing.
Yes.
I spend a lot of time in jam band worlds where we're partying with psychedelics, and it's like it's a massive part of my cultural identity, but I understand it's very distasteful to huge portions of the psychedelic community.
Mm-hmm.
But it's it is part of it. It's part of the history. It's one of the flames that kept it alive for a few decades, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
It's time to be tolerant. We need to be tolerant. It's very important.
It's hard for people to be tolerant for some reason. I don't understand it. I don't know. Like, do you have any observations around that? Like, why is there so much kind of cultural sensitivity or like lack of tolerance around some of these
because
situations?
Of the propaganda that was, because of the war on drugs, because of Nixon, because of Reagan, because of people that said that cannabis kills brain cells, because of people that said that psychedelics would make everybody psychotic. So that really worked. I mean, people really believed those myths, and it really took very sustained research work over many decades to overcome this. Now I think the genie is out of the bottle. It's very hard to portray psychedelics as something tremendously harmful and dangerous. So this moral panic is no longer doesn't stick anymore. But I can also see how very repressive political forces of oppression can also develop a discourse that embraces psychedelics. Among the people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th, there were some folks that seemed quite psychedelic. So I think that just to think that people that are doing psychedelics or embracing psychedelics or interested in psychedelics are going to be people that believe in community, that are tolerant of differences, this is also naive, right?
Right. Yeah, the political thing. Like we assume it's going to be a political utopia, but that's really not the truth, right?
Not necessarily.
Right. And we have this argument often around ecological sensitivity as a result of psychedelic use, nature relatedness. Sam Gandy's work, and that was a pretty small study. I think that was only 14 people, maybe.
Yeah.
In that trial.
Yeah.
So like it's really hard to universalize, right?
I think that it's going to go in that direction, but we need stronger evidence.
That's my sense as well. It was a huge part of the hippie movement and the whole Earth catalog, LSD and ecology. It's a hard argument, but it's an important one.
Yeah.
Let's see here. I took a whole mess of notes before we started here. So you're in Brazil. Like, what are the legal statuses of a lot of these compounds in Brazil? Is it kind of ambiguous or explicit?
Well, if it's synthetic, it's forbidden, and you can do research, but it's quite hard. It's difficult and it's also difficult not just from the regulation in the country, but also difficult from companies that there are many barriers to selling these substances to the third world. And this also applies to cannabinoid research. So if I were to be working in the US or Canada or Europe, as a researcher, I would be able to buy any cannabinoid, overnight, and basically have no special permit for that in most cases. It's just treated like any chemical. This is not the case at all in Brazil or in most Latin American countries, because there's not just the regulations in the country, but also the regulations in the U.S. and the regulations in Europe. This is the case for synthetic substances, but it's absolutely not the case for those substances that are coming from traditional use. For example, ayahuasca or jurema. And this was something that happened in the 80s, that the conjunction of forces from Native Americans, from different churches that use ayahuasca as a sacrament, also from anthropologists and from politicians. People in the 80s got together and they created the possibility, the political possibility of having ayahuasca be entirely legalized in the religious setting. And this is the case now. And it has been the case for all these decades. And because of that, research with these substances becomes so much easier. And this is how I began my research in psychedelics. This is also how Braulio de Araújo began his research. We did it together early on. We began in 2006. And we really didn't have to bother much. It was quite easy to get ayahuasca from people from the churches. They were very nice and gave substances so we could do our studies. And it was not difficult at all to publish. No journal gave us a hard time because they understood it was something coming from a traditional source. We just dosed what was in there, and that was fine. So I think Brazil represented and still represents, less now because there's more opening now. But 20 years ago or 15 years ago, it was actually quite a stark difference between say Brazil and the US, in that this particular substance and other substances that have similar origin are just fine, and you can investigate them, even though they're quite potent. So it's not about how potent it is really about its cultural background. And so I think even though we have so many handicaps for doing science in Brazil, this is one particular aspect in which we're quite privileged.
Yeah, that's beautiful. In the 80s, that's fascinating that it happened so recently, or early /
involved like some public figures, some celebrities, and the arguments that was used for peyote in the United States, for Native American church. A very similar argument was made for ayahuasca, and this hadn't been the case. This was not the case. For example, when cannabis was purged from Afro-Brazilian religion. In the 30s and 40s, Afro-Brazilian religions, drum-based cults of spirits, were persecuted, oppressed, and eventually they conquered the freedom that they have now. They conquered the right to exist, but they had to purge themselves from, for example, cannabis. And this also happened in some of the early ayahuasca religions, that some of them, not all, were associating with cannabis, and they had to purge it. They had to get rid of it. But this was not the case with ayahuasca, and this is not the case with jurema. And there are other things going on, of course, in the Amazon. The Yanomami, for example, they have the Yakuana snuff, which is quite powerful, has DMT, and in some preparations it might have 5-MeO DMT as well. And I think it's interesting to consider that these religions, not just the syncretic religions, but also the Native American rituals, they worked as a defense that allowed researchers, biologists, physicists, biomedical researchers, to learn And it's similar to what happened to curare, this poison that comes from the Amazon, that really changed our understanding of acetylcholine and the neuromuscular junction in the 30s. That knowledge comes from non-scientific traditional populations, and it becomes science right away. And so in that sense, scientists need to be quite grateful and respectful of those societies, because it was these societies that kept this flame alive, that kept the knowledge, and then gave us this knowledge to a large extent.
Would you call it simply biopiracy, or is there more going on there in these kind of like borrowing or taking from?
I think in most cases in the end it's biopiracy because it's most often the case that the benefits never come back to the communities that originated the knowledge. And I think it's very important that people that are doing research in this field right now understand the needs for compensation and reparation. Compensation every time and reparation when needed. And this compensation should not be just material compensation. It has to be also at the level of immaterial things like the knowledge that was created. This knowledge has to be shared and it has to go back and forth. I think people are aware of that and it's part of people's discourse, but sometimes it's not part of people's practice.
Have you seen any good examples of how to do it? Because I know there were some sort of international accords made a while ago, kind of like biopiracy international accords. I don't know if the U.S. signed it, but it was a big deal. I would like to find the name of that thing, but
I think we're more on the side of bad examples. It happens all the time. For example, people came to Brazil and they got the fruit called açaí, which is this purple fruit that is delicious and quite nutritious, and it became very popular. It went from the Amazon region to the entire country of Brazil, and now you can find it in the U.S. and Europe. But then, people came from out of Brazil to Brazil, got this fruit, took it back, and then tried to patent it. It's kind of crazy stuff, and patent the name also. So this kind of crazy behavior, I think, needs to change. One thing that I saw happening near my own laboratory was the way that Braulio de Araújo was able to investigate ayahuasca in a hospital setting and do a clinical essay for depression that was actually the first well-controlled, randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trial for depression using a psychedelic. That was the one with ayahuasca. And I think it was quite interesting how he was able to bring this knowledge back to the ayahuasca groups that with which he interacted during the course of many years. But I think, but of course, these are people that are also living in the city. I think it gets to be more important, but also harder to do when you need to dialogue and feedback, give feedback to people that live, many, many days away from you up the Amazon. But nevertheless, I think it's very important to do that because we need to really make sure that the improvement that comes from this research does not benefit only the societies from which the medicine doesn't come from. So we need to understand that there are many ways in which this research can go back, and that goes from visiting them and having interactions and dialogues and lectures and also listening, but then producing other ways of enrichment of that community that do not necessarily have anything to do with that science, but that somehow bring the benefits of that, even monetary benefits, to those communities. It's hard to do it, and it's against the capitalistic plan for those substances, which is to extract more profit. So I think it's to investigate psychedelics just as any substance that can allow for more profit. I think is really dangerous, and it should not be morally accepted.
Right. We've got to think long and hard about it. We're thinking about it regularly here. Um, I've regularly actually been considering this funny crux because I come from the Stan Grof lineage where it was LSD in Switzerland and pharma, right? And it's the plant medicine traditions never really didn't play much of a formative role, other than my first big experiences was ayahuasca, so I have to credit that.
Your first
So
one?
yes,
Huh.
yeah, I had been growing mushrooms. They didn't, for whatever reason, it didn't work out right. But ayahuasca, yeah. After 6 years of holotropic breath work, I jumped to ayahuasca. I wish most people would do it that way, honestly, but
Interesting.
that's a quite privilege of having a lot of time, I guess, and a good network. Yeah, and yeah, for what I've actually been considering this. Like, why did I have not that much access to substance for a long time? I'm okay with it. I'm happy with where I'm at now, but it's substance was not available for me, and I was in a zone that was quite psychedelic for a long time.
Just breathing.
Yeah, just holotropic breath work. Yeah, and yeah, I actually remember the first time I got to sit down with Stan Grof for a long time, like over dinner at one point. I told him I had not had LSD yet, and he was like, "Whoa." like kind of like oh, you're here at this table, and that's true. Like,
Wow.
it's kind of interesting to have that. Yeah, where was that? I think that was at a conference years ago in Claremont, California. It was fun. It was really, really great to have that conversation with him, and I love his kind of hierarchy of like activity and dose. So like what's appropriate at what doses with LSD. It was like pretty fun. Yeah. But yeah, that's an interesting crux I have around reciprocation with the traditions, and the fact that I come from this LSD world. But the LSD and transpersonal psychology world was heavily informed by the traditions, so I have to recognize that as well. Yeah, but it's not like I'm trying to run around it and evade responsibility. It's like I think about it at least,
I see.
and we are trying to figure our way through that.
My feeling, Joe, is
Please.
that we are really close to a very big positive change. And the reason I believe it is because it's obvious that we have accumulated in the past 3 million years such a wide and rich wealth of knowledge from many different sources that if we were able to gather the best of all that we have and apply it, we would reach world balance and harmony quite quickly. If we think of the financial capital that is accumulated now, the technological capital, the human capital, we have it all. But we're still confused about something that is quite basic, which is that we need to share. People are still, even though many people profess themselves as Christians or as Muslims or as Buddhists, when it gets to actually sharing, they have a hard time. And so that causes, a situation in which, the rich countries in the world have many more vaccine doses than they can use or that their population wants to use. And most countries in Africa have no vaccines at all. So this sort of imbalance, it's no longer about knowledge, it's about wisdom. And I think we are at the cusp of the change. The change has to come. It must come. And it's a change that was envisioned in the 60s. So there's the political aspect to psychedelic research that I think is now ripe. And we need to move forward. And we need to go to a place in which people are having access to healing experiences and actually not getting traumatized by society. So we're talking about the end of police brutality. We're talking about the end of female exclusion, the end of gay hatred. So these things need to happen, and we are not there. And I think we may never get there. It's a dangerous situation. But I don't think we're going to have a long time in this planet if we don't solve these things. The good news, in my opinion, is that we now have the means to solve those things, those problems. If you know, if I don't know, hundreds of years ago, Genghis Khan said, "I want to end starvation in the world," he wouldn't be able to do that. There were no ways of doing that. As powerful as he was, we didn't know enough to feed everybody, for example. But now this is actually solvable. And the fact that we're still not doing it, it shows our lack of insight. It's our lack, our, we have a defective sleep and dreaming, and this makes us less insightful about the consequences of our actions.
Yeah, yeah. I'm very scared of climate change, we'll put it. And I remember recently somebody came on the show and said, surprise, we've already solved it. We just have to implement it. And I actually just scooped a copy of Wired magazine somebody left somewhere because they had this article about climate, and apparently we need 10,000 of these factories worldwide, and we can extract all the carbon we need to do this well. The point is we just have to do it.
Sounds doable.
And that's only one of many technologies, right? There's so many we could use. And,
yes. Yes.
Like, perhaps I should be less scared, but, the sixth great extinction has begun.
It has. We're drowning in a glass of water, but we're drowning. Mm-hmm. So we need to wake up.
Yeah.
We need to wake up.
And psychedelics can't help. This is one of the things I really particularly like about some of my psychedelic experiences is that I've been able to see around a lot of these blocks that I just kind of live with. You're like, even if I'm at a concert, these things come to me. It's like, okay, like, cool. Like, this is kind of, there are paths forward here. It's not a dead end. And, there are ways to keep improving culture and the betterment of all humans. Like, this is something that is possible, and psychedelics can help us see through that. And
totally.
Maybe a banal but helpful last question before we kind of wrap up our recording here. The terms plant medicine versus psychedelics, do you see any kind of like collision between those two or conflict between those two ideas?
I don't see collision nor conflict, but of course there's sacred plants and sacred fungi and sacred animals, and potentially sacred other things as well. So I think we need to be very curious about psychedelics and new synthesized compounds. We need to be open to that. There's so much that we don't know. Just by revisiting the contribution of Shulgin, there's so much of that stuff that he synthesized and experimented with that we know so little about. And I think it's really, really wonderful. It's a lot of interesting work ahead of us. But I think we need to be very clear about the respect, the reverence that needs to be exercised when we're talking about some natural product that has sacred treatment by a certain culture. To understand let's say, the cultural aspect and understand how the cultural aspect boosts the biological aspects and can actually define which way it goes. This is essential. And I think it's essential beyond anthropology. It's essential for neuroscience. It's essential for psychology. It's essential for biochemistry. To have people that are doing this kind of research, they have no understanding of those aspects. It can produce very naive, very disingenuous, and very misleading discourse. And I think this is also happening right now. But I think the community is strong and aware. And I don't think that we're going to will fall in this illusion. I don't think it's possible because we know better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Sidarta, this has been amazing. Thanks for recording for such a long period of time here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
excellent questions and provoking questions.
Thanks. I think we haven't had anybody from Brazil on the podcast in quite a long time. So glad to finally have
It's an
Brazil
honor.
represented.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Muito obrigado.
Do you want to share any links or information, how people can follow your work or anything like that?
So they can they can look me up at the website of our institute. It's neuro.ufrn.br. It's my university, UFRN, and BR is Brazil. And then you can find the different the different principal investigators, and my lab is one of them. My lab is called Memory, Sleep, and Dreams. If they're interested in my work on sleep and dreams and the research, they can read my book, The Oracle of Night, by Pantheon, published by Pantheon last year. And of course, there's tons of stuff available on YouTube, and a lot of it is in Portuguese, but some of it is in English. So I'll be very happy to get feedback from the public.
Outstanding. Well, Siddhartha, let's do this again. This is really fun, and I've got now a lot of incentive to come to Brazil. So, thank you for being.
Please do. You'll like it here, and we'll go scuba diving together.
Fantastic. All right. Until next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.